My name is Amanda Basler, and the Death Investigation Training Academy was instrumental in helping me get the job that I needed in the field of death investigation.
"3617, respond to report of shots fired."
The Coroner Talk podcast takes you behind the scenes with coroners, clinicians, and death investigators from around the world to provide training, news, and interviews from leading experts in the area of death investigation and scene management, bringing real stories and solid training together in one source. Now, here's your host, Darren Dake.
Well, hello and welcome to this week's episode of Coroner Talk. I am so happy that you joined me today. I always say that this is the only podcast in all your podcast directories that has to do with death investigation, except for the true crime stuff, right? However, I'm going to talk a little bit about a new podcast that you might want to listen to, and it is really, really good show as I'm looking for it here to tell you what it is. It's called Body Bags, and it's with Joseph Scott Morgan. Now, Professor Morgan has been on the show before. He's been on our show before. He's wrote a couple of books. He's a long-term medical legal death investigator and now a professor. But the podcast is called Body Bags, and he does a good job of breaking down several cases. Some of them he talks about the difference between a coroner and medical examiner, and I like the show, so I'll probably do a little bit more on him later and talk about that podcast. But again, a little different than what we do, but yet he has a lot of good education on that podcast. So again, called Body Bags by Dr. Joseph Morgan. Check that out. I'm sure that you will like it. And let him know that we sent you, okay? Let him know that we sent you so he knows that we're talking favorable about him. And of course, remember, we still have a lot of training. As this comes out, there's still a little bit of time left to get involved in the March 5-day classroom MDI course. And we can get you into that. And, since the last week, we've got 2 or 3 other states booked. Mississippi, I think Nebraska now, and Kansas are all booked for training. So if you have a state that you want us to come to, we're now booking for July, August, and beyond. Let me know. I'll be glad to come. And one last thing. I want to know your feedback on Wendy. Wendy's been on the show now for a few episodes, and she's going to stick around for a while as long as she can continue to put up with me. So I want to know what you think. What do you think about our conversations? What do you think about what she's adding to the show? And, of course, anything that you want us to bring in, we can certainly do that. All right, so today we're going to talk about genetic genealogy and solving cases. And I know several months ago, in fact, it's probably over a year ago, we had somebody on that actually did this genetic work. The scientists came on the show and actually talked about how these cases work and how they did their job and things like that. Today, Wendy and I are going to talk about actual cases that has been solved by these, and not just the ones in the national news, but some that we've worked ourselves and how the footwork gets done. So, Wendy, welcome to the show again.
Good to be back again, Darren. Thanks.
So I always appreciate it. We'll get some listener feedback. I know what I've heard so far, everybody likes you, and probably more than me. So that's going to be good. That's what I want.
That's a good thing. I'm glad.
Yeah. So genetic genealogy, I know that we've had somebody on the show a long time ago talking about it, the scientist part, but I want to talk about the footwork part, right? You've got a lot of insight into this. You've actually got some cases under your belt, and you know a little about it. So what I want to do here is just kind of turn this over to you and just tell us what it is. First off, somebody might not even know what it is, right? They don't even know what I'm talking about with this genetic genealogy and tracking down suspects. What is it? How does it work? And give us some examples of a case or hypothetical or whatever. And then after you're done with that, I may jump in with some questions. We'll kind of go from there. But at this point, I'm turning it over to you.
All right. Well, I've got a couple cases. I've actually worked with the forensic genetic genealogy. I've got a murder case that I've been working with that. And then I've also got an unidentified decedent at the coroner's office that we are using the genetic genealogy to try to identify him. So far, we've been unsuccessful, but we're continuing. In fact, I just got an email today from the genealogist that I've been working with, And she said that the DNA Doe Project has a couple more tools that they want to try to use on difficult cases. And she's trying to coordinate a Zoom meeting next week with the DNA Doe Project and her and I to try to kind of jumpstart my case that's the unidentified out of Summit County. But as far as the law enforcement aspect of it, the genealogy is it's kind of coming up to be a really good tool for solving cases that you don't have an identity of a suspect for. And a lot of times what happens is if you've got some DNA from your crime and you've tried to enter that sample into CODIS, you're not coming up with a hit. So then that means that your suspect has not been arrested for a crime that has gotten them into CODIS to be compared to with the sample that you have. So if you've exhausted all efforts in traditional investigations, which you have to do that before you resort to the genetic genealogy, you have to go through and do all your good old cop work and eliminate every other aspect and possibility. And then if you do resort to the genealogy, then you can get your sample. What we had to do is give our DNA sample to a different lab, and they broke it down even further into what they call SNPs. And I'm trying to remember what that stands for, but that's what enables the genealogy to come into play. It breaks it down into a code that is read by the genealogists by a program, and there's only 3 programs that will allow law enforcement to access their databases, and it's I think it's Family Tree DNA, GEDmatch Pro, and I've got it written down here somewhere because I took notes. Yeah, GEDmatch Pro, Family Tree DNA, and DNA Salts. Those are the only databases that law enforcement can access to try to find a match for a suspect. And once, like with our case, it took the genealogist, I think it was just over a year for her to kind of go put everything into the family tree, build out the family tree. They go through and verify things through public records, through death records, through marriage records. And then once they get things worked down to some possible suspects, then they give law enforcement the names, and then law enforcement has to go through and verify whether or not that is a good suspect. And in my case, we went through several suspects before we got to the actual one. And then when we got to that one and I was able to verify that it was him, then we were successful in solving that case. And it was, at that point, it was a 39-year-old case.
Was that a murder case or a rape case, or?
It's a murder case, a double murder case from 1982.
So let me ask you a question. Was the DNA you have blood that was found at the scene that you thought was the suspect? Or?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, it was blood that was found on one of the victim's items.
Very interesting. So let's back up a little bit and talk about how you said the scientists actually work to backtrack and verify through public records, and they do a lot of that for you. Now, sometimes you got to still do some of that police work yourself, but
right.
But you they backtrack that, and they give you a list of possibles. So why are they giving you a list of possibles? What are they narrowing it down to, and what does that list of possibles mean?
Well, what they're narrowing it down to is the nearest closest relative to what my sample is that I sent to them. So they give me, like, for instance, in my case, she would call me and give me a name. It says it could be this guy. So then I had to do some good old-fashioned detective work and try to find a DNA sample for that person that she named, because I did some checking and found out that he was deceased. He was also killed in another state. So I tracked down, and since that case was unsolved, I was able to track down tissue samples, tissue blocks that were being kept all these years by that medical examiner's office in that state. So they sent me those tissue blocks, and then I sent them to Colorado Bureau of Investigations, and then they extracted DNA from those tissue blocks and compared it to our sample, and they said, no, not a match. So it's back to the drawing board. I told the genealogist, it's like, okay, we need to try again. And she kept working it down until we got to another suspect, tried to check that one out. And again, he wasn't a match. And he was also deceased. And then waited a few more months. And then one morning I got a call from the genealogist, and she said, I have two names for you. They're brothers. It looks like a really good match. They match. They have a high value on because they match it by number of centimorgans of how closely they match. The higher the value of centimorgan, the more likely it is your suspect. So she said, here's two names, vet them out, see if they're a match. And I did my homework and vetted one out, and the other one was my suspect. So then from there, I had to verify his DNA to see if it was in fact him. So then and he surprisingly still lived kind of sort of locally, not too far away. And we put him under surveillance. We're able to gather surreptitious DNA sample, took that to Colorado Bureau of Investigations, and they were able to make a positive match.
Interesting. So going back to this genealogist, whenever he gave you brothers, okay, there's two brothers. So
right.
So how did she come to that? Because their DNA isn't on file, correct? So that means they narrowed it down to third cousins, second cousins. So how do they? So what I'm familiar with, let me go back. Maybe this helps ask the question. What I'm familiar with is, okay, we've narrowed this down to third, second cousins, and now we have, some possibles based upon a relationship to the cousins, and then we have five first cousins. Of the five first cousins to this person, we went from the third cousins and lots of fourth and fifth cousins. We've got it down. There's five people that is a cousin to this person, and those five people are this, and one lived here, one lived there, and we have to narrow down whether those people lived there at the time or where they were at or if they're still alive. But your genealogist did that for you, right? Meaning that was through public records, birth records, marriage records. There's no DNA on file here. So now we know that, in my case, my cousins, Tasha, Gorman, April, Miranda. Okay, so there's four cousins of mine. So those are four cousins known that my mom's brothers and sisters had kids. And that's what they're doing, right? Through those records.
Right.
And then they don't have criminal history on those people, right? They're just saying these people could be, that these closely match. Not that they have their DNA, but because of the records, these are in this area. So, and if they were born, not that it matters, but let's say that they were one of my parents' brothers or sisters moved all the way across the country, had a couple of kids, and then they had kids, my cousins, whatever. Well, they've never left Oregon, for instance, and I live in Missouri. Well, would they know that? They wouldn't necessarily know they didn't drive to Missouri. I'm not saying that. But that would be less likely than those that stayed in Missouri? Is that kind of what they look like? That's a broad question, I know.
It depends. And again, it's tracking the person. We have to track that person through public records. And it takes a little bit of detective work to get that done. Because if they're someplace else from where the crime was committed, then it's going to take a little longer to track them down. And then you have to get that surreptitious DNA. But that's the key is you've got, if you verify, you have to do your work and it's like, okay, this person is a high likelihood of being my suspect. Now my final step is I have to get that surreptitious DNA. That is the final step that has to be done. Once you've gone through all of the footwork and base work of figuring out tracking their movements wherever they've gone, and going back again to getting records. We talked about last week of using Clear or Accurate or some program like that law enforcement uses. We can track where people have lived. So we can track them down. And it just so happened my guy lived actually relatively close. So we were able to coordinate with the law enforcement agency in that area and surveil him and got his DNA, and it came up to be the match. But it takes a lot of work, and there's a list, a checklist that I watched several videos, webinars that were done by Verigen. It's a 4-part series. The 4th part has yet to come out, but in the 3rd part, it was the guy who talked was a detective, and he has a cold case investigative checklist that you can go through and make sure you have done all the steps up to the point where you get your DNA to match.
Interesting. Yeah. So that'll help you, because we're not going to do these every day. So when you do them, having that checklist certainly, of course, helps. So let's talk about collecting the DNA of your suspect. You have to set up surveillance. So what are some of the ways, to explain to our listeners, what are some of the ways that we would collect that DNA or get something that we could obtain DNA from? What are some of the things we're looking for, and what is the footwork for the law enforcement to be able to gather that or to collect that?
For that, it's surveillance is you have to do your surveillance on your suspect and see if they're abandoning, and you have to make sure that and it's legal in whatever state you're in and jurisdiction that you're in. You have to work closely with your district attorneys and make sure you're doing it legally by your state statutes. But if they abandon their DNA in trash, for example, or they go to a restaurant and they're eating, you happen to be standing nearby, you work a deal with the restaurant, say, hey, can I act as a waiter or busboy or something like that? And as soon as the person has left and abandoned their DNA on silverware or a cup or a plate or napkin, then you can go in, take that, and then that's your evidence to turn in to be analyzed by a DNA analyst to see if there's DNA on it, or a trash search. And again, you have to go by whatever your laws are in your area on the legalities of a trash search, because some of them are changing. There's been challenges being made to those types of searches You still have to get your search warrants, but once they've abandoned that DNA, they've thrown it away, they've abandoned it, then it's fair game for you to get.
Right. And you got to be careful too about the restaurant thing.
Right.
If you don't pose as the busboy type action or waiter, whatever, and clear the table, and you have somebody else like the staff do it, you have to monitor that, because if that ever gets out of your sight, that chain of custody is gone. You could never go back and say, I watched him drink. He set the cup down. It never got out of my sight until I collected it.
Absolutely.
So that's a cautionary tale there, because if you can't justify that and say that, you've lost it. Even though you've got a great case, that DNA is lost. You're going to have to figure out, go in another way. And so, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Chain of custody is absolutely critical in something like this, because you're doing your surveillance, and then you see them throw something away. It's like, ooh, that could have DNA on it. You better be the one that's going in and snagging that item, because I can guarantee you the defense attorneys are going to attack your chain of custody on your evidence as hard as they can, because that's the only way that they're going to be able to get the case thrown out.
Yeah, and if you've got a Starbucks cup at a Starbucks and he's drinking it and he throws it away, and you look in the trash can and there are 15 Starbucks cups in there,
right?
You're not going to be able to, again, that's going to be something, it may be the one on top, or it may be the one, but still, that's going to come into question big time, because everything all matches, right? I mean, those are just, we know that, but those are just ideas to think about for our listeners to think about. There's a lot of things that can go right, but there's a lot of things that can go wrong in these, as well. So,
or they could say that, like, the lip of one cup slid across the other cup, so it transferred the DNA. There are so many arguments that could be made there. So you have to be absolutely certain you're getting the right piece of evidence picked up, and maintaining that chain of custody. That is absolutely critical for your case.
And it would be good too to have more than one item. A cigarette butt in the morning,
right?
A soda cup with a straw at lunchtime. If you could get 5 different items or whatever, 4 or whatever, from this one suspect, and then they all then this less likely. Well, you picked up the wrong cigarette. Well, you picked up the wrong cup. Well, now wait, I have 5 pieces of evidence here that's discarded, and they all match. So
right, and if you watch them discard that item, then you're good to go. Or if you do a trash search, if they set out trash on the curb and they've got a bunch of items in there, and you're absolutely certain that that person is the only person that occupies that building, that residence, there hasn't been anybody else coming and going, then you're fairly certain that anything inside that trash bag that they've drank from a can, or their cigarette butts or whatever, is going to have their DNA on it and nobody else's. But there you have to document.
Yeah. And I could see that having holes in it. So yeah, everything you just said is perfect. Yes. If we can get one more thing from him personally, that's the better. Because then even though you've documented several days, somebody can say, well, yeah, but someone had left a soda cup there, and that wasn't my guy. Well, I mean, whatever. There's so much to consider.
Right.
But we use trash we build cases on trash a lot of different areas. So, but those things certainly can be an issue. Now, in your guy, in one of these guys' case that you're working on, and not what he did, but did this guy who you said it was the case that he was involved in was a double murder, did he go on to lead a non-criminal life or a less criminal life? Obviously, he didn't have arrest with that required DNA. So was he like living a life for the last 39 years or whatever it was normally? Or was he...
Pretty much. He had some minor issues. I've heard about some other more serious stuff, but it's nothing that I've been able to corroborate because it was so long ago, and we are just unable to locate any records of that, any police records. And I mean, we have beat the bushes to death and we can't find anything. So from the outside perspective, yeah, he's lived a fairly normal life with some traffic infractions, but that's it.
Sure. Well, you know what made all of this genealogy, DNA, and all this come to light was the Golden State Killer.
Yeah,
that was all work behind the scenes because they come up with the idea, and a genealogist said, "Let's try it," and they worked. Nobody even knew about it really. I mean, this wasn't until they arrested the guy. Because once they arrested a guy, then everything was proven, hey, this really does work. Well, now it's becoming more and more and more popular because that's the first case that got broke open, like, oh, this really does work. But that also caused some adjustment in this family tree DNA stuff. You know, you buy at Walmart and swab your own mouth and send it in. And you mentioned 3 companies that allowed the database to be searched by law enforcement. But there's some restrictions now, like when I would send my DNA in, which I have not and will not do that. If I send my DNA in to find my long-lost relatives, I have to agree, don't I, to have that in the database? I have to click on something or do something.
And it used to be, and it was explained in court by the genealogist in my case, that it used to be that you could go in and click to opt out there on these databases that still let law enforcement search them. You could opt out, but now they've changed it. They've reversed it, and you're automatically opted out. So you have to go in manually and opt in to allow your DNA to be searched by law enforcement. So it's kind of another layer of protection there for people. They can't say, well, I didn't know that law enforcement could search my DNA. No, you went in and checked. I want to opt in. Yeah. So they know that law enforcement can search their DNA.
And that's good. I mean, another layer of protection. It's going to lower the amount that's going to be in the database for us as time goes, because some people may not care, but they might not take the time to click on it and say, allow it, right?
Right.
Some may be like me and don't want the government to have any more than they already got. And so we may not do it, you know. No, I'm being facetious there. But you know, I just, there's going to be limits on people who agree to that. And so that can help. That can probably hurt us in the long run as far as finding these. But there will still be some matches probably out there. But the people sending it in to get their family trees is becoming very popular. And if now we're, of course, limiting it. So it has to be the person agreed to it. Now, it's not searched by genealogy. You can't even get a search warrant to check that. I guess you can't because you really don't know what the search warrant is. It's because at that point it's just going to be, it's too broad. There's no specifics, so you can never get a search warrant. Yeah, right, exactly. So what is the average cost of the one? Well, for instance, they're all different, but like on your cases, do you know what the average cost was on yours?
For my murder case, the genealogist that did it for me, she actually did it for free. Okay. That's she doesn't do it normally for free. No. And she's very good at her job. She's fantastic. And there were several cases here in Colorado that all got solved because of her work within a week of each other. And they were long drawn out cases that were very cold. And through the miracle of genetic genealogy, these cases, all 3 popped like within a week of each other. But for our case, she made an exception. We did have to pony up money for processing the DNA sample, having it reprocessed by another lab. And I think that costs us, I want to say it was $2,000 or $2,500 to have that done.
Right.
And as far as the cost of the genealogy work, that I don't know, because like I said, she did it for us as a favor to one of the higher law enforcement officials in the state.
Right. Well, and I had some of the scientists on from some other labs that do it, and they're really, and they really won't talk price either because there's no way to know, right? Is this easy?
Right.
How long is it going to be? How much is it? But if you have a case, if you're an agency out there listening and you have a case, you can contact one of these genealogy services, genealogists, to do this, and they'll tell you pretty much what the starting price is and how far it can go. They can talk price with you, but nobody's really willing to say, yeah, you can get that done for about $20,000. I have no idea what the number would be. They just don't want to do that. I mean, I can't imagine it'd be that high, but nonetheless, whatever it is, if it's a cold case and there's any hope of solving it, you know what? We spend a lot of money on cases. That's not very much money in the whole scheme of things. Trial's going to cost more than that. So
right.
So,
yeah, but we were very fortunate to be able to get the skills and of this forensic genetic genealogist. She was fantastic, and we got a case solved. And she's also helping me through the help of the DNA Doe project to try to identify the unidentified remains that I have at the coroner's office. Like I said last week, it's literally a skeleton in our closet.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, it'd be nice to get that identified if there's family member out there to let them know. But, we never know about those things. Sometimes we find family members, it's been a long time. It's a couple generations back, and they don't even know the guy. They're related, but they have no idea who he is. They've never met him or whatever. So you've had a couple of cases. Have you got another case that genealogy has solved for you? I think you had two. You said
no that was one. I had just have the murder case and then my unidentified case.
Unidentified. That's what it was too.
Yeah.
But you're still working that one back.
Yeah, and then that one I'm still working on. Like I said, the DNA Doe project has a couple new tools that they want to try to test out, and they want to use my John Doe in Summit County. I call him Spencer because he looks like a Spencer. We had a clay reconstruction done of his skull, and to me, he looks like a Spencer. So that's what we call him.
Yeah. And when his name is George, you're going to be like, well,
yeah. But this guy, our unidentified, his remains were found at the top of a mountain, and he had clearly committed suicide. And he went to great pains to make sure that he could not be identified. He used a Glock 45 caliber weapon. And it just had one bullet in it, and it was locked open. It was right next to the body, and he had used an intraoral gunshot, so it exited the back of his skull. His teeth were other than the front teeth, the back teeth the molars were pretty well preserved. He has had an extensive amount of dental restoration done that were not the gold, but it just left my brain, the other kind of dental restorations done. And he had on hiking gear, he apparently did this when there was still snow on the ground, because he was wearing like a snowmobile type suit. He had a backpack with him. It looked like he was an experienced backpacker, because he had all this backpacking equipment with him, or at least like day hiking equipment. He had North Face clothing, had high-end like headlamps and water, and we were able to narrow down when he went missing, when he committed suicide, by the date on his chapstick and his water bottle that were in his backpack. But everything else, there was not one thing in his backpack or on his person that could possibly identify him in any way, shape, or form. And we have exhaustively tried to identify who this guy is. And I had like I said, I had a clay skull reconstruction done. Used his eyeglasses, put them on him. We took pictures. We put him in NamUs. We sent the remains down to UNT to have a whole anthropological workup done, and DNA, dental, the works, and entered everything into NamUs. And I worked every lead that we got as a result of that, but now I'm dead in the water again.
Right.
So the DNA Doe project is helping me through genetic genealogy. I took one of his molars and sent it off to a lab. We had DNA extracted for the purposes of using with the genealogy. And now they're trying to track him down through genealogy. But again, we're not having any luck. So maybe with these new tools that DNA Doe project has, and they want to use him, Spencer, as one of their test cases, maybe we'll come up with an identification on him.
So how long had he been out there about?
He had been out there, let's see, for 2 years before he was found.
And there's no proof yet, of course, that he's even from the United States.
Correct.
And that could make it harder.
Yeah. And that's one of my other theories, is that he's also a guy that is wanted in France. And it's a pretty big case, but he's wanted in France for killing his whole family. And then they think he fled to the United States. And I honestly think it's this guy, because I talked to Interpol, an Interpol agent, and we talked about this case. We talked about what I had and what evidence that they had that could tell me a little bit about that guy. He was a heavy smoker. In his backpack, when we opened his backpack, it smelled of cigarette smoke. His backpack also is a type of backpack that you can only buy in a certain part of France, where he was from. And I think, I'm trying to remember correctly, I think that guy also had some military background. And with one thing that kind of stood out to me was he had a Glock 45 weapon, and along with the magazine that was still in the gun, he also had 2 other magazines that were full. Who carries 3 magazines?
Right.
Cops and military.
Yes.
So that tells me he could be former law enforcement or former military.
Yeah, interesting. So,
and he had punched off the serial number on the gun.
Oh.
He had taken a punch and hammered out that serial number on the gun, so we couldn't trace it at all.
That was my next question. Because I thought, well, if he's coming from France, he probably didn't ship a gun in. He might have, but he probably didn't, right? So if he got over here and he bought the gun, then he would have. He might have bought it off the street, but maybe not.
Right.
And so it would be interesting. But yeah, no, you answered that before I even asked it. So that's out. But that France connection is interesting. Those things kind of add up. What about DNA of the family? Can France get DNA of extended family to check against yours?
I was told that there's different laws in France concerning getting DNA for comparison. And so I still, Interpol came back and said, no, it's not him. But I'm like, okay, they said he's not in CODIS, or it's not and it's like, he's not going to be in CODIS because he didn't commit a crime here in the United States to get himself put into CODIS.
Right.
So we're not going to get a match from CODIS. Yeah. So I'm still kind of battling that a little bit, because I still think it's him. I really do. Just because there's so many other things that add up. cumulatively that I think it's him.
So I'm just shooting broad here. So Interpol may not be able to help. There's different laws in France. I get all that. But if you think this guy is from France and he killed his family, so could there be the option that someone, then who's that family? Well, there's a living relative, and the relative would sure like to know who killed the family, whatever, and where this guy is.
Right.
So there's a living relative is like, a little bit of detective work, track down some family and say, hey, you don't have to get a search warrant. I'll give it to you. Let's find out if it's this, my cousin or my grandpa or whatever. So chances are you'd have to have probably a private detective, probably in France, if there's PIs in France, can work with them, whatever, to track some family members down of this case and say, we have a possible, are you willing? Well, if they volunteer, then that should be fine, right? I mean,
right.
So that would be an option because you again, we don't know it's him, but the 3 or 4 things you just said, it's like, yeah, that's that's a pretty good indication, really.
Yeah. It's, I mean, and when he sent me pictures of this guy and he had the glasses on, and I'm sitting there looking at the computer, looking at the pictures on the computer, and looking at my skull reconstruction right next to him. It's like, this is him. It looks just like him. And the glasses look identical. Right. And he's smoking. Right. it's like, oh, this has got to be him. It's so frustrating.
And then working to find out if this guy's ever been to America. Does he know about, Summit County? Has he been skiing over there? What would be this guy's connection? How would he end up there? And why would he end up there? That would take some detective work on the France side, whether it be law enforcement or private. Someone over there would have to kind of dig into that kind of stuff probably, because then they make the connection. Oh yeah, they've been over, skiing, or they know this or they know that or whatever. So,
yeah, and he's still wanted in France.
Yeah,
because as far as they're concerned, he's still alive and wanted. And it's like, well, don't you want to know if this could be him and he's dead? Then it's saving you a lot of work here.
Well, and they probably ain't putting a lot of work into it anyway because it's been a few years.
Yeah.
So he's just kind of off the face of the earth type thing. So so let's we're getting close on our time here. Let's kind of sew this up with some cautionary tales of what there's a checklist you said, but what are some of the things? Let's just think for a second. There's a listener out there right now that's got a case. It's like we had a case a number of years ago, and we do have blood that we do really feel is from the suspect. This might work for us. What are some of the things they needed to have exhausted first? Maybe not all of them, but what are some of the big things they need to have exhausted first?
They need to go through and they need to make sure that they've exhausted all of their the familial work through DNA, through CODIS. Make sure that's all been exhausted. And then they have to start preparing the case to go forward to the genetic genealogist and identify any distinctive MO, identify similar crimes in the geographic area, identify possible motives, identify and prove or disprove potential suspect alibis, identify and evaluate potential affirmative defenses or like self-defense, identify potential gang or criminal enterprise involvement, and memorialize and evaluate all exculpatory information related to the suspect and persons of interest. And get all your police reports together, put everything together in a hard file and document everything. Have every police report, have every evidence sheet, every transfer of evidence, every testing, the results. You need to have every document done and in a case file, in a hard case file, and then present that to your DA, and then say, okay, can we go forward and talk about it with your DA and your upper command, and make sure this is something that we need to go forward with. This is the only way we're going to solve this case. Because there's a lot of work to do
Yeah, and I say this, I don't mean it this way, maybe, but is it worth it? Now, every death is worth it. If someone is a suspect out there, or if it's a rape case, every case is worth it. But sometimes, if it's been a number of years and you've exhausted all leads, command staff, DA, the checkbook has to say, well, we have a better chance at this double homicide because we have more blood and we have more evidence than we do on this rape case from 15 years ago. Although that's important, you have to weigh it out and go for the one that you think is, well, two things. Maybe the easiest to solve, maybe, because let's get it cleaned up if we can. But then also the bigger of the crime. And that's, and just coming out of my mouth saying that, I'm like, but I mean, rape is a massive crime. I mean, so I'm not at all putting that on a back shelf because that victim's still alive. That's horrible. But you have to weigh it out and say, how can we've only got limited money? Which one can we spend first on? And it's been my experience that sometimes it's which one do we think we can solve first. Let's solve it because that could be quicker, easier, and cheaper. That was off the book. Then we do the other one. And if they're both equally hard, then it's probably going to fall down to the double homicide or the kidnapping and rape of a young girl. Those are hard decisions to make. And the person that has to make that, they're going to answer for why they chose this case over that case. And that can be difficult, I would say.
And that's something that comes down to a good conversation with your district attorney or prosecutor that is going to be prosecuting that case, is that you have to ask, can the crimes that were committed be charged?
Well, that's true too. Right.
And so that's what you kind of have to look at. And it kind of goes with, I hate to say it's a popularity contest, but like with this double homicide, this has been a high profile case for 39 years and everybody wanted this solved. And when it comes down to the checkbook, I can tell you that when I worked for the district attorney's office early on, before I came to Park County Sheriff's Office, every time I would ask the district attorney at that time for money to have DNA testing done, because we wanted to send some DNA off to Parabon to be looked at. And I got turned down flat every time. And so I kept getting told, no, we don't have the money to spend on it, or we're not going to spend money on it because the DA said, I don't think it's a solvable case. But then when we got our new sheriff on board, he wanted to go after this case. He wanted it solved. And so he was willing to open up the checkbook, and he approached the county commissioners, and they said, yep, go for it. We will spend whatever it takes to get this case finally closed. If you're that close, let's get it closed and move on.
And in fact, you have.
Yes, I have.
Yeah. So last question here, similar, but not really. Have you ever gotten a John Doe warrant based upon DNA? I mean, have you ever?
No, I have not.
So I haven't either. We've got one that we were considering, but we found another way and we ended up making an arrest. But so a John Doe warrant is when you have DNA, you can actually get a John Doe warrant based upon that DNA. And so you don't even know the person yet. You just have a DNA profile, but that helps to freeze statute of limitations. What brought my mind up on that is when we're talking about rape cases, and we're talking about cases where can't even be prosecuted. Statute of limitations are gone. But if you get the John Doe warrant based upon DNA profile, that is a human, and that human has a warrant. Now, we don't know the name of that human yet, but that locks that in, is this person is who we have a warrant for. So, the listeners out there, they can, if they've got a case that they want to do that on, they can check with their prosecuting attorney if that's something they'll do or whatever. It's called a John Doe warrant based upon DNA profile. It works. It happens. It's very effective. Of course, it's new over the last several years because we used to never hear about it because we never had DNA. Now we have DNA. We can prove this is the human we want beyond the shadow of a doubt. And so, however, there is one exception to that. There is one exception. There is one case where human DNA is identical, and that is in identical twins.
Yeah.
And so if that's ever the case, then now you've got two people. You've got to do, extra work to see if you can figure out which one it is or whatever. And I have heard, and I am not an expert on this, so I'm going to say this generically because I don't know the facts. There are times that bone marrow transplant recipients can have a change in DNA, or they always have a change in DNA, or something has to do with DNA changes with bone marrow transplants. Now, I'm going to stop there because that is not my area of expertise, but your bone marrow can affect DNA. Now, that's something the listeners would want to research a little bit because it can modify some things. Well, because of the the bone marrow producing red blood cells and things like that can cause some things. Now, I don't know. That's different than just receiving blood. Like if you just receive blood in a car accident and the hospital gives you blood, well, that's kind of a different deal. So anyway, that's homework for our listeners to go research when and if and how often something like that can interfere with the actual DNA. So with bone marrow transplants, but there's something to do with it in some cases. So it's interesting to know that because you may have a case working that direction. So
yeah, that'd be interesting to find out.
Yeah. So I'm glad you worked. They got this case solved. I'm glad you have. I mean, we've got some that we've worked backwards some. We haven't done a full genealogy. We got one we think we might try on. At this point, we haven't decided for sure it's worth it. Not worth it to the family, but worth it. Like, are we even going to be able to make the case once we know who it is? So there's sometimes those cases as well. Is it is like you said? Is it self-defense? Is it is it clear-cut homicide? Well, then that's one thing. So. Yeah. It kind of
and you run the risk of if it's a really old case like ours, is the suspect still alive?
Right.
Well, you don't know. And you don't know until you get down to the end.
Right.
It's like, okay, he's dead. So case closed.
and I'm not going to say you've wasted a lot of money, but in effect you have because you still can't bring anybody to justice. Now, you know who it is.
Right.
There's that. Right. But yeah.
And you can give family of the victims answers.
Sure.
It's like, okay, we know who their killer is, but they met their own demise and we can't prosecute them. But at least that they would have an answer that's probably been bothering them all these years.
Sure. Absolutely. That's true. Well, Wendy, thank you again for a great conversation. This is a very interesting case. And of course, you've got two of them. We definitely, since you're going to be on for a while, we definitely want to hear about Spencer when and if you find out he's Pepe Le Pew or whatever French name he has. So that would be great if he's that guy, because you put that together. That would be interesting. So keep that in mind and make sure you let us know whenever that happens.
Oh yeah, I'll keep you updated.
Yeah, for sure. So for your listeners out there, again, thank you for joining us for another hour of Corner Talk Podcast. Remember, anything we can do for you, anything that training you want, if you want special shows, if you want us to talk about certain topics, certainly let us know about that. We want to do everything we can for you. And I could do it every week when I close the show. I want you to find a way to be a blessing to somebody. I know you might get tired of hearing that. I don't care. I want you to find a way to be a blessing to someone, as simply, as small as it can be, or as large as it can be. Find a way to be a blessing. And of course, we want you back next week. So above all, be safe.
Thanks for listening to Coroner Talk, a DSBN media production.
Visit our website at coronertalk.com.
And be sure to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/coroner training.
3617 1024 scene en route to morgue.